Today we're going to be classifying quadrilaterals. Now, before we get started, let's remember that a quadrilateral, we look at that word quad, means any shape or really any polygon with four sides. So no matter how you draw it, whether you draw a square or you draw, whatever you want to draw, as long as it's got four sides, it is a quadrilateral. So let's go ahead and move on to those notes. The first shape you should see looks a little bit like this. So if we look at these shapes, you might recognize this one, but the one next to it, you might be like, Miss Wilson, that one's different. Yeah, I got that. But these are both trapezoids. They are both trapezoids. Now, the rule with trapezoids is they have to have at least, that word at least is super important, one pair of parallel sides. We're going to have fun spelling parallel so many times today. One pair of parallel sides. So if we look at these, we can see that this one and this one are parallel, but these two are not parallel. Same over here. We can see this one and this one are parallel, but this one and this one are not. So that tells us that this is a trapezoid, even though it looks a little bit different. It's got one pair of parallel sides. Let's move on to the next one. Next, you've got this shape. You should know this as a parallelogram. Parallelogram. Make sure you're labeling it. Now for this one, it is super important that the opposite sides are parallel and congruent. The opposite sides, let's put sides in there. Opposite sides are parallel and congruent. So if we take a look at our shape here, we can see that this side and this side are parallel and they're the same size, so they are congruent. And then this side and this side are congruent and parallel. Remember that word parallel means if they were to extend in both directions forever, they would never ever cross. They are parallel lines. And a parallelogram has opposite sides of parallel lines and congruent. Both sides need to be parallel and congruent, though. Let's check out the next one. Actually, let's back it up. Remember how a trapezoid had to have at least one pair of parallel sides? This parallelogram has at least one pair of parallel sides. So we can say that this parallelogram is also, you don't have to write this, a trapezoid, because it's got at least one pair of parallel sides. That's going to get a little confusing and exciting as we keep on going. Your next shape looks like this, and you should know that this is a rectangle. Just a plain old rectangle. Now, a rectangle is a special parallelogram where it's got the same things as a parallelogram, opposite sides that are parallel and congruent, but it also has four right angles. So you need to know that it has four right angles and two pairs of parallel and congruent sides. I spelled parallel wrong again. Nope, actually that's correct. Two pairs of parallel and congruent sides. So this rectangle is just a special parallelogram with four right angles. It's also, you don't need to write this, it's going to get long, a trapezoid, because it has at least one pair of parallel sides, and it's a parallelogram. Parallelogram. Too many L's, but that's okay. Let's move on to our next shape and see how much deeper we can get. This is a rhombus. R-H-O-M-B-U-S. Rhombus. Now, a rhombus is a special parallelogram with special parallelogram with all congruent sides. All congruent parallel sides. There you go. So take a look at these. I know that this one and this one are parallel and congruent, but this one and this one are also congruent. So a rhombus is basically a square that's kind of been sat on a little bit. So if we look at it, it's also a trapezoid because it's got at least one pair of parallel sides. It's also a parallelogram because it's got two pairs of parallel sides. Now, it's not a rectangle because a rectangle has to have 4 right angles. Let's go on to our last shape. This one is a square. Now, a square is a very special parallelogram with 4 congruent sides and 4 right angles. Let's take a look at this shape. You've got 1, 2, 3, 4 right angles and 1, 2, 3, 4 parallel and congruent sides. That's a very specific shape. But let's take a look at it. It has at least one pair of parallel sides, so it's a trapezoid. It has 2 pairs of parallel sides, so it's a parallelogram. It has 4 right angles and 4 pairs of parallel sides, so it's also a rectangle. And last but not least, it's a parallelogram with congruent sides, so it's also a rhombus. Squares are the most specific quadrilateral we're going to talk about because theoretically, it's all the other quadrilaterals, but more specific. This is going to make a little bit more sense with the next part that we're doing, where we're going to be classifying them just like we did with our triangles and quadrilaterals before. Now, first things first, we need to label our diagram here. You need to draw one bigger box around, pretend it's your paper. One bigger box around. And this big box is labeled quadrilaterals. Quadrilaterals. So those are the quadrilaterals that aren't anything else. They don't have any parallel lines. They're not trapezoids. So like things like a kite, where there's no parallel lines, but there's still 4 lines that make a polygon. That would be a quadrilateral. This next one in is a trapezoid. Now, a trapezoid's a pretty general quadrilateral because it only has one pair of parallel lines and nothing is congruent. So we can draw shapes like this trapezoid. Make sure to pause the video if you need to draw some shapes as well. Those are trapezoids. Now, if we get a little bit more specific, we can write parallelogram. Now remember, parallelograms have at least 2 pairs of parallel sides. So we have some parallelograms. Now remember, a parallelogram is also a trapezoid and it's also a quadrilateral. But a trapezoid isn't necessarily a parallelogram. Because remember, the parallelograms have to have 2 pairs of congruent sides or 2 pairs of parallel sides, where a trapezoid only has to have 1 pair of parallel sides. Let's get a little bit more specific. In this left box over here, let's put rectangle. Now remember, a rectangle is a parallelogram. Oop, I drew my rectangle a little big there. Because it's got 2 pairs of congruent sides, but it also has 4 right angles. Now let's go over to rhombus here on the other side. A rhombus is not a rectangle because it doesn't have 4 right angles. A rhombus, remember, kind of looks like a squished square. So it's got 4 congruent sides, unlike a rectangle, but it doesn't have any right angles, so it's not a rectangle. A rhombus is a special parallelogram, just like a rectangle is a special parallelogram. Now let's get as specific as we actually can and label it squares. In the very, very middle, you have the square. Remember, the square is in the very middle because it's a rectangle and a rhombus and a parallelogram and a trapezoid and a quadrilateral. This square has 4 right angles and 4 congruent sides. So it's a really specific rectangle and a really specific rhombus. I hope you understood how we are classifying these. I'm going to give you some questions here to answer. They seem like logic questions, but make sure you're using the notes you just took, and they should be pretty easy to solve. Remember, always ask questions if you still have any at the end of the lesson.